Welcome and good morning from behalf of the whole team of the Philosophical Film Festival. My name is Anna Dishlievska-Mitova and I'm the festival director. It is a great pleasure to have you here with us today. Welcome and good morning. And just a moment, only we have a little, yeah, perfect. I think that we are now good. It is a great pleasure to have you here with us today. And above all, my feeling and the feeling of all our team is a feeling of gratefulness that you have bared with us for the past 365 days. And despite all the uncertainty, that you have given us the trust to be part of this conference, although for a long time we didn't know whether it's going to happen, if it's going to happen, when it is going to happen, or how it is going to happen. So after a year of planning and replanning everything, although we are not here in Skopje, in our hometown and the capital of Macedonia, where initially the idea was to make this gathering, we are still glad that we've managed to keep the communication and that the first international conference in this area in the framework of the Philosophical Film Festival can take place as part of this 11th edition. The past year has been very difficult for everyone, and in particular also for everyone in culture, because big cultural events have been forbidden or had to postpone or be able to take place in very different ways, and it is luck, and we feel joy that we are still here today and that we have the festival, and that we can have also this online format of the conference. This year's edition will be under the symbol of time, the time that we have lost, the time that we have gained during the last year. All the reflections, collective or individual meditation that we've had during the past 365 days, and all the orientation or disorientation on where to go next. This is also why this poster and this year's visual of the man in the middle of the sundial, but a man without a shadow, and a clock with the hours mixed up while he's in the desert and trying to look which direction to take. This festival has been meant to be our small contribution into trying to find some kind of a direction with the help of cinema. And we hope that the conference will be also opening up a space for this kind of a reflection and being able to serve as a platform for dialogue in which we will open different questions. The idea, just shortly, the idea for the conference, we had it for quite a longer time. So last year we were ready for it, but time was not ready for it. This is why it happens only now. But what we wanted to do is to create a space for dialogue which sometimes we don't have so much. Also, being outside of the European Union, traveling is not always the easiest. So this is a way also to be able to gather the East and the West and the North and the South and try to provoke a discussion on these topics for the first time in Macedonia, but also like in the Balkan region in this kind of a way. So we are very glad for all of you that accepted our invitation and that you've decided to take part in the conference. I think that my colleague Jasmina Popovska from the Faculty of Philosophy will say a bit about the beginnings of the festival. What I would like to only say is after 10 years, 11 years now of work in the festival, who has turned from a small student initiative, and I can freely say it was rather a film club that was happening in the library of the Faculty of Philosophy at the time when also I was a student, that now we have this international festival. Philosophical film festivals are not so frequent in the world, and it's the only one by its size also and its form in the world having as well competitive programs. I just wanted to express one desire for some kind of a future development of the festival. We are working quite a lot on this academic area of trying to develop more research in this area in Macedonia, in the region. This is why also this conference, but also we are working in the area of practical application of this area of inquiry with the audience. So this is what makes the festival specific. But what I would hope to also see, and I think that we all already have the little seats in this conference, that there will be also transdisciplinary projects or practices or artistic approaches that may come up from this relationship between film and philosophy, and that we will see more and more of those coming up in the future in the region. I would just finally like to thank our co-organizers, together with the Philosophical Society of Macedonia, who is the organizer of the festival and the conference. We had this year with us the Faculty of Philosophy of St. Kira and Methodius University, the oldest university in Macedonia, and also the Faculty of Dramatic Arts. So we will hear Professor Popovska now, who will tell us a few words in the name of the Faculty of Philosophy, and then we will continue with our program. So I wish you pleasant encounters, a lot of inspiration also to the audience that is following us through our YouTube and Facebook channels or is with us in the Zoom room. Don't shy from posing questions. So you have a way in the Q&A chat also to pose your questions. So we will do our best to answer as many as we can during the discussion sessions. And I wish you a nice day. Professor Popovska.
Thank you, Anna. Dear participants, dear colleagues, dear guests, on behalf of the Faculty of Philosophy Skopje, I would like to welcome you to the first international conference, Philosophy and Film, held in the framework of the 11th Philosophical Film Festival. Faculty of Philosophy is the home of the festival, where 11 years ago at the library of the Institute of Philosophy, as Anna said, the first projection was held. It was a small, enthusiastic, and at first innocent student initiative which organized movie projections every Thursday, followed by a philosophical discussion. We started slowly to dive into what film philosophy is. The initiative was growing and slowly emerged as a serious and one-of-a-kind cultural institution, not only in Macedonia, but worldwide. After hundreds of events and thousands of people infused with the magic of film philosophy, the festival is returning back into the academia. In the history of philosophy, the philosophical topos always transitioned from the agora towards the academia, from the city square towards the school. The festival showed that the opposite direction is possible, the transition from the academia towards the agora. The idea behind this transition was that the philosophy should be happening not only in the academia and should communicate with wider public. Philosophy emerges in all aspects of everyday life, and cinema can be easily transformed in a place where ideas can be exchanged and developed. However, this transition never meant that the academia should be suspended. The Philosophical Film Festival never forget the need for reflection of the cinematic phenomena And this is why Faculty of Philosophy for the past years was always a place where film philosophy issues were reconsidered over and over again. Now, I cannot count how many lectures, student workshops, movie projections we organized for both theoretical and educational purposes, which made Faculty of Philosophy center of student critical and creative thought. But the organization of this first international conference, Film and Philosophy, represents the highest and most suitable form of contribution towards the reflective segment of film philosophy. I see this process in terms of Hegelian synthesis, where the film philosophy is getting to know itself, to objectify, to find itself again, to liberate itself, and to connect firmly with itself. For these reasons, I really believe that this conference will be the first of many more. And the start is impressive. 15 participants from 14 countries will be discussing on various issues considering film from a philosophical point of view. We are very pleased that we will have the honor today to hear one of the most eminent experts in this field. The multidisciplinary approach of the topics that will be presented today gives important insights not only to the philosophers who investigate film as a medium for thinking through images, but also to the film practitioners who approach the film on a meta level. It is not a coincidence that two academic institutions that are devoted to philosophy and filmography are co-organizers of this event, namely Faculty of Philosophy and Faculty of Arts of the St. Cyril and Methodius University in Skopje. I really hope that this kind of reflection will be associated to the festival in the following editions, because it rounds out beautifully and brings it completion to its goals. I wish all the participants fruitful and inspiring dialogue, and all the guests of this film philosophy symposium a real intellectual delight. Without further ado, I will give this virtual floor to Professor Mimi Tanevska-Srbinovska, the Dean of the Faculty of Dramatic Arts in Skopje, to welcome you. Professor Tanevska-Srbinovska, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Greetings, everyone. The Faculty of Dramatic Arts and St. Cyril and Methodius University Skopje are pleased to be co-partners and co-organizers of this year's first international conference, Philosophy and Film, happening today. It is our honor for co-organizing this gathering of the many international guests, philosophers, professors, artists, intellectuals, workers from film industry and the film world today. As Dean of the Faculty of Dramatic Arts, I wish to point out that since its beginning, our faculty has consistently invested in increasing its regional and international relevance. We work actively following up and taking part into the global international events, this one included, even in this hard time of pandemic. This year, it is our challenge to be a part of this digital organized Zoom conference, where the new media will be in intersection with the philosophical thinking of the film. What connects philosophy and film is, of course, thinking. I wouldn't say anything new if I state that philosophy has long been considered the mother of science. Film, on the other hand, is a dynamic and relatively new art. I think that the combination of those two things, philosophy and film, can give interesting and useful results. The research, ideas, reflections, analyses presented at this conference will be of great benefit to all those who deal with the visual arts. Of course, they will also contribute to the theory. The philosophy of film is a branch of aesthetics within the discipline of philosophy that seeks to understand the most basic questions regarding film. Philosophy of film has significant overlap with film theory, a branch of film studies. There are two key respects in which the medium of film and the discipline of philosophy can intersect. First, the philosophy of film is an established subdiscipline that asks philosophical questions about the nature of film, or in other words, simply take film as its object. Second, film as philosophy suggests that films themselves can take up philosophical issues and can contribute a range of philosophical debates. At this conference, we are expecting excellent discussion from the speakers during this day. I am wishing you a good start to the conference and many more years of this collaboration to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the organizers who opened the conference, Anna, Yasmina, and Mimi. And I am moderator of the first session out of 3 sessions which we have today. The first session will consist of 5 speakers. The keynote speaker, Professor Hrvoje Turković, then Professor Darko Štrajn, then Diana Neiva, Professor Damir Smiljanić, and Professor Jono Melorka. So we have up to, so we are starting a little bit 10 minutes late, it's 9:25, but we should end at around 1:45, maybe 10 minutes more because we've taken 10 minutes more from your presentations. So I would like to introduce our keynote speaker. It's Professor Hrvoje Turković, who is a full-time professor at the Faculty Academy of Dramatic Arts, now retired, but part of the faculty and still teaching, and also of the University Vern in Zagreb. He, just small introduction to his lecture, and then I'm giving the floor to him. He graduated philosophy and sociology, and then he moved to New York City, where he his master degrees was in cinema studies, and then his PhD was in philology. And he's also author of 17 books dealing with cinema, philosophy, philology, and television and related issues. So he's truly a deserved keynote speaker. So to say, also he's part of the editorial board of the important academic magazine. It's called Croatian Cinema Chronicles. So without further ado, I want to give floor to Professor Hrvoje Turković. So just a small technical detail. Professor Turković, your time would be up to 9:55. Now with the change up to 10:05, and around 10 o'clock, I will give a visual sign like this, if it is okay with you, so that you know that you have 5 more minutes. And it will be for all 5 presenters at the first session, if that's fine with you, without writing in the chat. So it will be just a sign of 5 more minutes. So Professor Hrvoje Turković, we are pleased to have you. Please take your floor.
Okay, thank you. Do you see my PowerPoint? Hello, do you see my PowerPoint?
Not yet.
Not,
And now?
yes, yes, we can see it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. My topic is to make film philosophy a problem, or to show what is the problem with film philosophy. Now, I will speak about philosophy of film, not about philosophy through film, nor about film as philosophy. The reason is that I'm basically a film theoretician who dealt also with philosophical issues. And that's the reason why I'm primarily interested in philosophizing about the nature of film and different aspects of film. So that's, I'm more interested in philosophizing about film than in film philosophizing. I will not deal with it further, but it's enough just to have a hint what my approach is. Now, my starting questions are, what is film philosophy about, generally taken? And connected question, what is film philosophy about for real what is it actually doing? Now, the most generally, and I think the mostly accepted answer would be that the main concern of film philosophy is film art or film as art, namely either explicitly stated or implied. You know, the main concern is speaking about what constitutes film as art. So, for example, Barry Gott's book on philosophy of film is titled explicitly Philosophy of Film Art. And for example, film theoretical book, textbook by David Border and Christine Thompson is titled Film Art. Most of topics dealt within the philosophy of film are assuming that they are dealing with primarily film art or films that are considered to be art. This assumption is quite well historically entrenched. Basically, it has a historical origin. Namely, the first serious theorizing about film was motivated by the understanding that film has capabilities to be art, or later on that there are films that are non-controversially accepted as film art, as paradigmatic work art. So this motivation predominated not only philosophy of film, but also aesthetics of film, of course, and by definition, and theory of film. So even, for example, today it is assumed that the main topic or the main orientation of thinking about film is motivated or is directed toward the understanding of the functioning of film art. Even the textbook, the technical textbook about, say, cinematography or about script writing or about editing are assuming that they are preparing filmmakers for artwork, for art creation, you know, just giving certain elements to start creating art. So, but this assumption that actually film is an art is actually completely unwarranted. But before I'm giving the reason, which you can read also, I will just have to point that the statement, film is an art, is so widely accepted that it enters into the classification of, for example, university teaching of film and university lecturing on film, like for example, in Zagreb University, in classification of fields, study fields, filmmaking is under the under the field of art. So arts, so like music, like theater, film is classified as an art. All film, like actually all filmmaking. And for example, what I am doing, theorizing about film, is under the category science of art. It is filmology, film studies are called filmology in Croatia and I think also in Serbia. But basically it is under the science of art, and science of art is under humanities. So obviously even the institutional classification is accepting that film, generally taking, is an art, and that those people who are researching film are researching art. Now, it is not, as I said, completely justified, because there are kind of very complex film works that are not intended to be art, nor are considered to be art by most accounts. For example, there are instructional, educational, and science films, reportage, film and TV news, informational, promotional documentaries, different kind of TV program, which we can take as video works. Neither of them were taken to be samples of film art almost by no one. They are mostly not intended to be art. It is very far off idea that they can be art, and of course not accepted. Let me repeat myself. Now, all this variety of film and video works are completely out of the picture within theorizing about film. Now, mostly they are considered to be below the threshold of what serious philosophy or serious theory can deal with, you know, or are permitted to deal with. They're below our interest. But basically, just to conclude this part, film generally taking is not an art, or not just an art. It is, there are all kinds of film, or all kinds of film kinds that are not art, and film as art is just one kind among other kinds. So, as you can read, film generally can be taken as an art, but also it can be taken as an art. It can be seriously dealt as an art and seriously dealt in other kinds that are not art. And basically, naturally, film philosophy and film theory should be concerned with all types, all kinds of art, all kinds of film, no matter, or including film art, but not restricting our research on film art. Now, theoretic. Now, generally speaking, if we want to identify a particular field of creativity or of activity or of communication, usually we have to draw a difference with other connected but different or contrasting phenomena. And actually, it was going on within the philosophy and within the theory. But the main contrasting phenomena from the beginning of serious thinking about film have been other arts. like film was postulated to be an art, and in distinction to other older and different arts like paintings, literature, drama art, music, and so on. Just a moment. Now, the main problem for film philosophy was so-called specificity problem or distinctness problem. How can we make distinction between film and other types of art? But another implicit problem, which was present from the very beginning, was how to distinguish film art from non-art varieties of films. Basically, the question was, according to what criteria we can distinguish art variety of films from non-art variety. In the existing corpus of film, within everything that exists and is counted as film. Now, this question, this last question, this question of differing between art and non-art, was not taken up by film theorizing, neither by film philosophy, neither by film theory, and nor by aesthetics of film. But it was a very acute problem or topic for film criticism, because most of film criticism was oriented to understand whether a particular film is an art film or belong to art or is not, or is a good art or is not so good art or very bad art, or whether it is not art at all. So the contrast to non-art kind of films was established almost from the very beginning. For example, art films were routinely contrasted with merely entertainment films, and that's still a problem, for example, for especially US philosophers or theoreticians, that film is commonly within the film industry and between general public considered to be primarily entertainment form and not an art form. Or, for example, critics would contrast film as author's expression to the so-called confection film. That's the term by Croatian theoretician and filmmaker Branko Belan. Or in industrially produced film, like films that were produced within the Hollywood studios. Or, for example, art films were as films for film's sake, so to say, was contrasted to the more utilitarian kind of films like commercial, political propaganda film and so on. So there were the contrast of films that belong to art and films that don't belong to art, though they constituted articulated kinds of film, were present all the time and is still present. But the problem is that this non-art side of films were not seriously dealt with within the philosophy of film or film theory. So they were out of center of consideration. They were not dealt on a neither even slightly were not dealt. Now we can see with some theoretician and some theoretician of film and some philosophers of film, like for example, David Bordwell, a theoretician, primarily theoretician film, of film, or Noel Carroll as primarily philosopher of film, that they would mention that film is not just art, but there are some kinds of film that are not art. But usually they would mention it casually, by the way, just to dismiss them from further consideration, or to say, okay, it exists, but our concern is primarily with art kind of films. Now, what is the fact that most of theorizing about film have taken into account only the art side of films, ignoring the non-art side, have, I think, very serious consequences for the validity, or for the application of validity of or theorizing. Namely, basically whatever topic have been tackled within the philosophy of film, or film theory, or aesthetics of film, were meant to be artistic properties, or properties of film art, and that they're specific to film art, or constituent elements of film art. Let me see some examples. For example, the one of the basic questions of philosophy of film is the question whether film can be art. But because this question, film can be art, is actually the question whether there is a possibility to be artistically creative, or creative within the film, have basically missed the point. Namely, creativity is not limited just to art, but it can be found in all different fields of intellectual endeavor, and in all kinds of films, not only art film. For example, scientific films can be quite creatively constructed. Educational film can be quite inventive. Commercials can be highly inventive. So all kinds instructional films also. So all kinds of non-art films can be highly creative. So creativity is not just chained with art, but it is available in all types of film. The second question is question of media specificity or distinctiveness of film art. But all what was said answering or discussing this problem have been applicable to all kinds of films, not just to film art. For example, we could say what is specific for film is that it is photographic medium. Okay, it's instructional film or photographic, done in photographic medium. So there also the fact is specific for all types of films, not only for art films. The next question, for example, the question of ontology, what kind of thing is film? But this question is valid for all types of film, no matter whether they are considered to be art or non-art. The next question, for example, what are basic elements or structural constituents of art films or of film art? That is the basic question, which is answered mostly by aesthetics of film and theory of film, but also by some philosophers and some philosophical papers or books. For example, the question of shot, what is shot? What are determining aspects, parameters of shots, or the question of editing, sequencing or segmentation of film. These questions or this, the knowledge about it is applicable to all kinds of films, not just to art films. And for example, the question of fictionality and sectionality, distinction between feature films and documentary films, have been valid for all instances of them, not just for art films. So any kind of documentary could be judged as art, but also as non-art, and also with fiction film. Now, one of the very widespread field of philosophizing and theorizing about film and aesthetics of film, of course, is the question of the nature and structure of narrative. But basically, we can find structured, narratively structured films which are not accepted as an art. For example, exploitation or pornographic film, but also in routine feature reconstruction within historical scientific films. So the question of narrative structure is not specific art question that solves the problem of distinguishing art from non-art. And finally, one question within the narratology or narrative theory is the question of film narrator. And as you well have experience with, the question of film narrator is not limited to feature film, but is very active in, for example, news program, in reportage, in science documentaries, or in educational film and so on. So again, the problem of narrator is not limited, to distinction, is not distinctive for just art. And so on. We can list a lot of other problems that are not limited or considerations that are not limited just to art, but to non-art kind of films. Now we can ask whether such generalities of philosophy establish that most of the specific questions that are dealt within the philosophy of film, and of course theory and aesthetics, are more general than art field or art region, so to say. And I can say that this is quite normal, that philosophy is dealing with all kinds of film, and what they're saying about the nature of film that is applicable to all kinds of film, not just to art kind of film. So that is normal. This overgeneralization or this generalized approach is normal and expected and okay. But what is not normal is that philosophy of art, theory of art, philosophy of film, theory of film and aesthetics of film is not conscious that they are not dealing with art of film, but they are dealing with wide field of different kinds of art and non-art films. So this limited consciousness, or this lack of consciousness, this ignorance that they are dealing just with one kind one limited kind of films, ignoring the vast field of other kinds of film, is what is handicapping actually the philosophy and limiting not limiting, but preventing them to have serious insights into other kinds of films, but preventing them to be more specific in speaking about those kinds which are legitimately or widely considered to be artistic or art. So trying to be specific what makes a film an art or acceptable as art is actually not dealt really with, because all the questions philosophy of film is dealing with are valid for all kinds of film, not just for art film. Now I will finally, in conclusion, I hope I will, and as originally planned, not taking this possibility to prolong my exposition. One possible solution would be something that is self-understood from what I've been speaking about till now. First, the possible solutions. First, we have to accept in all theorizing, no matter whether philosophy of film, aesthetics of film, or theory of film, that there are different kinds of film, that art film is just one kind among the other kinds of film, and that all these kinds of film have to enter into the center consideration of theorizing of philosophy of film, not just art film. And when we are taking all this into account, when we become conscious of that, and specifically when we became conscious that the differentiation of film into different kinds is basically a epistemological problem, because every different film kind is specific epistemological task or domain. And actually the task of philosophy is to understand what specific epistemological possibilities are developed or researched or experienced within these different the specific film kinds. So it is just a task of epistemology, not just dealing with what makes film aesthetic, but what makes film, for example, informative, what makes film expositional, what makes film descriptional, and so on. Philosophy of film and aesthetic have to stop relegating their investigation just to now what makes film aesthetic, what makes film an art, generally is relegated to the general philosophy of art or general aesthetics. So within the general philosophy of art, the question of what are defining features of art or art experience or of artworks is dealt with within general philosophy of art and or general aesthetics. So it was not considered to be a specific problem for film aesthetics or film philosophy. But now I'm proposing that if we want to learn what makes some film aesthetic, that is the specifically film problem, and we have to take empirical point of view, taking into account films that that are considered to be unproblematically artworks, to see what makes them within the film world, what makes them art, not from some deductive point of view of all arts. And finally, I'm repeating what I said. The final point is that basically all functions of film have to be approached empirically, and from empirical point of view, to learn what makes all kinds of film, and among them, what makes a film an art. So that's my concluding remark. Thank you very much for attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Turkovic, for the wonderful lecture about film philosophy as a problem. I want to remind our audience that you can ask questions for our speakers in the question and answer part of your screen. And also, because we are going live stream on YouTube and on Facebook, you can also post questions there. And the Philosophical Film Festival will congregate them for us. And now I want to thank you so much again, Professor Herbert Turkovic, for your lecture. And now I want to welcome a great friend of mine and one of the greatest persons I know and work with. It's Professor Darko Štrajn from Slovenia. He's a full-time professor at the Educational Research Institute. He's also a full-time professor at Graduate Schools of Humanities in Ljubljana, and also a professor at the University of Nova Gorica, also in Slovenia. But what is not written in the program of our festival is that Professor Štrajn is also UNESCO representative for Slovenia, and together he and me are editors of a book series about Søren, the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, within Trinity College in Toronto and a research center in Ljubljana. So we know each other for 15 years or so. So huge thank you to Professor Darko Štrajn, and the floor is yours. The topic is the question of transcendentalism and cinema. Darko, please.
Okay. Hello, Jasna. Thank you very much. It's great to see you in your native Macedonia. But I expect to see you in Ljubljana in August live. I suppose.
Yes, I hope so. Thank you.
Yes. Well, although I'm very much tempted to take the subject matter from Hrvoje on, I will reserve that for the discussion time, and I will try to present as briefly as possible my topic, which is announced in my summary of this for this conference. So I'm discussing the question of transcendentalism and cinema, which is of course a very complex question, but for this conference, I'm concentrating on one case actually, and this case is a meeting of Gilles Deleuze and Paul Schrader. You know, Gilles Deleuze was, of course, because he died in '95, he was probably the greatest philosopher of 20th century, at least for the French readers, and Paul Schrader is a bit unusual Hollywood filmmaker, and so we'll see where they met and how they met, and how the transcendentalism was an issue between them. So in his book, the Image Time, Gilles Deleuze legitimizes himself as a thinker of continental philosophy, who, when meeting a writer from American culture, it identifies two philosophical traditions, different logics, which are based on a perpetual misunderstanding. When he, namely Deleuze, analyzes films of Yasuhiro Ozu, he mentions Paul Schrader's interpretation of the same author. He disagreed with Schrader's definition of the difference between the quote-unquote everyday and the quote-unquote decisive moment in Ozu's films. The problem is the notion of the transcendental. What Deleuze points out in a footnote in the relevant context of his text is, okay, I should put on my PowerPoint. Yeah, I hope you can see it. What he puts in his text is, unlike Kant, Americans hardly distinguish between the transcendental and the transcendent. Hence, Schrader's thesis, which gives Ozu a taste for the transcendent, which he also detects in Bresson and even in Dreyer. Schrader distinguishes three phases of the transcendent style of Ozu: the everyday, the decisive, and the stasis, as an expression of the transcendent itself, end of quote. In the concluding chapter of the book, Deleuze is even more explicit when, again, in a note, he writes, Paul Schrader has spoken of a transcendental style in certain cinema authors, but he uses this word to indicate the sudden arrival of the transcendent, as he thinks he sees it in Ozu, Dreyer, or Bresson. That's in Paul Schrader's book, A Transcendental Style in Film, which was written in 1971. It is what Deleuze says further, it is thus not the Kantian sense which, in contrast, opposes the transcendental and the metaphysical or transcendent. Objection against Schrader acts as an illustration of the process of becoming, which is Deleuze's central category, by establishing a diametrically opposite interpretation of Ozu's work. So, according to Deleuze, Schrader uses the notion of the transcendental in accordance with his affiliation with American culture, because he denotes with this term something that, according to Kant, is exactly the opposite of the notion of the transcendental, namely the transcendence as a metaphysical category. Well, if we accept Deleuze's point, one would, as it were, seize an error in Schrader's use of the concept of the transcendental. The error actually stems from his disregard or perhaps ignorance of the double reflexive process by which a cognition of external reality is the result of a dialectical progression of perception. Schrader's understanding of the transcendental in both modulations of the term denotes something beyond, something spiritual, which means that we move from an epistemological theory closer to theology, because God, any of the concept it is replaced with, such as nature in Ozu's supposed Zen vision, is in a final analysis transcendent. The viewer who, according to Schrader, is interpolated into commitment accepts the philosophical construct which permits total disparity, deep, illogical, suprahuman feeling with a cold, unfeeling environment. In effect, he accepts a construct such as this. There exists a deep ground of compassion and awareness which man and nature can touch intermittently. This, of course, is the transcendental. This is Schrader's quote from his book, which he wrote as a student of film. And from this aspect, Schrader is very interesting. As a Hollywood director, he was so very much interested in theory. So, but after more than 40 years after writing this book, he wrote a new forward to new introduction to this book, what we will see later on in this presentation. Well, the most eminent representatives of critical theory, Adorno and Horkheimer, perceived the fatal attraction between Kant and the philosophy of film when they remarked, Kant intuitively anticipated what Hollywood has consciously put into practice. Images are pre-censored. Images are pre-censored during production by the same standard of understanding which will later determine their reception by viewers. The perception by which public judgment feels itself confirmed has been shaped by that judgment even before the perception takes place. I don't discuss the whole socially critical context of the quote here, but I can say that Horkheimer and Adorno have shown that the concept of the transcendental frames the operation of the cognitive apparatus, which, with the invention and operation of the film camera and projector, becomes materialized and thus also instrumentalized. In this sense, Gigaverto was probably the first and greatest spontaneous Kantian, as his camera acts as an extension of the mind with a feedback. The exchange between Deleuze and Schrader becomes even more interesting due to the new edition of Transcendental Style, that's the Schrader's book, in 2018. Which came out with an extensive new preface in which we do not find an explicit answer to Deleuze's terminological correction, but a concise summary of Deleuze's contribution. Schrader praises Deleuze above all for his invention of the image time. Anyway, he indirectly admits his mistake by saying Deleuze is getting at the nuts and bolts of transcendental style. This is what I was struggling, this is what I was struggling to apprehend. Our minds are wired to complete an on-screen image. End of quote. Although Schrader did not fully clarify the terminological problem in his new preface 4 decades and a half later, it could be said that he understood the issue of the transcendental in film, albeit in his own way, by adopting Deleuze's notion of time image. Thus, he says, post-war filmmakers realized that just as movement image could be manipulated to create suspense, time image could be manipulated to create introspection. We not only fill in the blanks, but we create new blanks. End of quote. Certainly, this is somewhat psychologized approximation to Kant's meaning of the transcendental, as it turns to what is intrinsic in thinking instead of something beyond. What is essential here, however, is that Schrader catches up with Deleuze in a view that affects the relationship between thought and film, and thus implicitly philosophy and film. And in the same preface, the Schrader then takes Deleuze's theory as a way to a definition of a relatively new trend in art cinema, which is called slow cinema. And slow cinema emphatically uses specific sets of cinematic means of image creation. For Schrader, whose discourse I summarize here in a very concise form, film technique in this kind of cinema emphasizes the dissonance between time and narrative. Let me just jump to another very important thinker, that is Walter Benjamin. I hope I'm still okay with my time. So starting from Duhamel complaining that my thoughts have been replaced by moving images, Benjamin developed a range of concepts which define mass perception of moving images. In the opposition between concentration and distraction, more relevant in the age of reproduction is the latter, namely the distracted perception. This is what Benjamin wrote: reception in a state of distraction, which is increasingly noticeable in all fields of art and is symptomatic of profound changes in a perception, finds in the film its true means of exercise. Although Benjamin, as it were, avoids philosophical categories in his conceptual setup, the background of the transcendental epistemology as foundation of the ontological notion of das Subjekt is evident in his explaining of the operation of cinema. Deleuze's claim that the screen is the cerebral membrane must be completed with his another assertion. The film does not record the filmic process in this way without projecting a cerebral process. A flickering brain which relinks or creates loops, this is cinema. So let me conclude that with the constatation that Deleuze anticipated what is happening now with in intrusion of the digital technology. Of course, he wrote the electronic image, that is the tele and video image, the numerical image coming into being either had to transform cinema or to replace it to mark its death. That's what Deleuze wrote in 85. In 85, the book was, the second film book of Deleuze was published. As we know, the mid-80s were the time when the digital technology was more of an idea than the real practice. But now we are submerged into digital world. So we have to deal with the question of transcendentalism in a new way with all this intrusion of the digital technology, which also transformed the film production. And many theoreticians, including me, are talking about the death of cinema. Okay, so with another quote by authors, and by two authors, Hölzel Ingrid and Marie Remy, in which they say, with digitalization, the image becomes equipped with algorithms that gather, compute, merge, and display heterogeneous data in real time. The result, however, is a different kind of image, no longer a solid representation of solid world, a hard image, as it were, but an unstable algorithmic configuration of a database of soft image. So we are therefore approach a time or an era where we have to come to terms with thinking machines, and which, when we put these thinking machines together with the Kantian notion of transcendentalism, makes the whole problem of epistemology different. So finally, one sentence relating to what Hrvoje just talked about is that the whole field of our visual perception is changed, and therefore also the very notion of art cannot function as it functioned until, let's say, the 80s. Thank you very much. I hope I'm in the time frame. Okay.
Yes, you are, and thank you so much, Darko, for the really inspirational lecture, and for your thoughts. Thank you also to Hrvoje and to Darko, and again a reminder to our audience that you can pose questions both to our box for questions and answers, and also on YouTube and on Facebook live stream. And now the third lecturer in our first session is Diana Neiva, who is a researcher and PhD candidate at the University of Minho Braga in Portugal. So we have our third lecture is from Portugal. The title of the presentation is Film as Philosophy and Thought Experiments. So I want to welcome Diana to our floor. Diana, please.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll start. The idea that films are or could possibly be philosophical goes back to at least the 70s with, of course, Stanley Cavell and Gilles Deleuze. However, the film as philosophy per se, that hypothesis became an independent area of research during the 2000s after Stephen Mulhall's book On Film and Thomas Wartenberg's Thinking on Screen, Film as Philosophy. In his book, Mulhall defends that some films can philosophize for themselves. They are not just material for philosophers to work on, but they actually think for themselves. Wartenberg addresses all the main objections made against that hypothesis, film as philosophy, in his book, and argue that films can philosophize in various particular ways, such as illustration, self-reflection, thought experimentation, and counter-exemplification. One of the main objections that emerged during the beginning of this debate, or at least this debate in the Anglo-American context, one of the main objections was made by Bruce Russell, and it was called the generality objection. Russell argued that, and I quote, "No one can establish that something holds in all possible worlds by presenting an example or two from a possible world depicted in film." End of quote. Therefore, as films are particular cases and philosophy is concerned with general claims, film and philosophy's ends are quite different and can never be equated. In other words, films cannot philosophize. This is the objection made by Bruce Russell. This objection is also related to previous problems raised against the idea that art can have cognitive value at all, especially objections raised against literary cognitivism by Monroe Beardsley, Jerome Stolnitz, or Peter Lamarck, for example. A typical response to such concerns is to evoke the fact that not always philosophy is interested in asserting general theses. Sometimes it creates thought experiments, which are particular cases. Thought experiments are particular fictional hypotheses. They are not arguments, nor they produce arguments. At least in my perspective, not mine. I'm following some philosophers, for example, Michael Bishop in his article, "Why Thought Experiments Are Not Arguments." Thought experiments, in this view, refine explore refinements and conceptual relationships that are not accessible in any other ways. In philosophy, thought experiments can serve various purposes. And if we regard some films as philosophical thought experiments, like, for example, The Matrix, which is a classic example of film as philosophy in Anglo-American philosophy, in the Anglo-American debates. If films like this can be seen as thought experiments, we can give the example of The Matrix posing the deception hypothesis, or Noel Carroll gives the example of the film Serene Velocity as a thought experiment that puts forward the hypothesis that movement is a fundamental characteristic of cinema. Now, thought experiments in philosophy can serve various functions. Thomas Wartenberg identifies 6 of the potential types of thought experiments: counterexamples, the ones that establish possibilities, the ones that fail demonstrating impossibilities, the ones that establish necessary connections, the ones that confirm theories, and the ones that serve to build theories upon. However, some problems in this appeal to thought experiments emerge. Even if we grant that a film works as a thought experiment, it would not be a philosophical one. For even if they touch philosophical themes, they would be limited by their narrative. If in philosophy thought experiments are accompanied by arguments and a vaster work, and it's made with explicit purposes, in a film that content would be implicit. This is an objection advanced by David Davis that can be seen as a version of the so-called explicitness objection made mainly by Murray Smith, according to which film's potential philosophical content is always ambiguous, thus lacking one of philosophy's value, its ability to make explicit arguments. Of course, this is a very problematic idea and conception of philosophy, and I personally don't agree with, but it's a statement that he makes, that philosophy needs explicitness, or at least that good philosophy needs explicitness, I should add, good philosophy. Furthermore, there's also the so-called rationality objection, which asks, why would we choose a less effective means to philosophize, film, when we have other proven effective means, such as texts? This is an objection made by Paisley Livingston. Another obstacle is also the means condition, which is a condition present in the Bull thesis, also posed by Paisley Livingston. The philosophy in the film, the philosophy presented in the film, but must be exclusively, or at least especially, produced by the specific medium of cinema. This is the Bull thesis. Now, not only we have concerns regarding film's abilities as thought experiments, but we also have doubts about the cognitive value of thought experiments themselves, of course. Even if films or books were to be considered thought experiments, they would immediately be regarded as bad philosophical tools or bad philosophical resources for philosophers who are skeptical about thought experiments at all. David Davis categorizes 4 types of positions about the cognitive value of thought experiments. On the one hand, we have extreme deflationists as Pierre Bourdieu or Carl Hempel, who argue that scientific thought experiments only have heuristic value. Moderate deflationists as John Norton think that the epistemic value of a thought experiment is minor, only reorganizing and making explicit what we already know about the world. To believe in a conclusion of a thought experiment, we need to reconstruct the thought experiment as an argument. So the thought experiment itself does not have value unless we reconstruct it as an argument. And in this case, of course, the film itself would not philosophize. It would be the philosopher reconstructing the film as an argument. This for the deflationists. On the other hand, we have inflationists. For example, we have extreme deflationists like James Brown, According to him, thought experiments reveal universal laws of nature and relationships between universals. This is a Platonic and extreme inflationist idea of thought experiments, and it's not very popular. It's just, I don't know any other main philosophers arguing for this Platonic idea. So let's put that aside and talk about the moderate inflationist view of thought experiments, which is my view as well, especially the naturalistic views. For example, Robert Sorensen, in his book Thought Experiments, argues that thought experiments are a kind of model reasoning that can eliminate irrationalities in thought. Thought experiments work on empirical grounds that we accumulate in our lives, combined with our ideas and innate structures or intuitions. Thought experiments are not supposed to give empirical knowledge, but to explore and define concepts. Other proponents like Catherine Elgin, for example, defend that thought experiments are not about giving knowledge, but about broadening understanding about certain themes. And indeed, we constantly see the philosophers using thought experiments to better understand and refine concepts or theories, not to give new knowledge. A subset of naturalism is the mental modeling account defended by Nathan Misevich. I don't know if I'm saying this right, I'm sorry. And Nancy Nersessian. Here, thought experiments are dynamic mental models, analogous to phenomena in the real world. Thought experiments do not create any new knowledge, but they highlight data that we already possess, which can be manipulated, transformed, and arranged in order to draw attention to something we had not noticed before. So we already know stuff. Thought experiments just reorganize that stuff. So here I adopt a moderate inflationist view of thought experiments, agreeing with the mental modeling account. Here, film as philosophy can survive the generality objections since films can be viewed as having the same kind of value of thought experiments. But can film as philosophy survive other problems? Even if we adopt a moderate inflationist account of thought experiments, such as the mental modeling view, we can see how cinematic thought experiments can be epistemically singular and cannot be viewed merely as arguments without epistemic loss. A mental model is not propositional, but almost bodily and spatial, and just hypothetical. It can even break laws. An argument cannot do the same things. So a thought experiment is not the same thing as an argument. Even if we agree that thought experiments are useful philosophical tools, and even if we agree that films can be thought experiments, why would you choose to watch films instead of just reading books? That's the rational objection. We should evaluate this hypothesis in a case-by-case basis. Maybe there are thought experiments that are better in text than in film. My main argument is that some films are good philosophical thought experiments, sometimes even better than traditional ones. In arguing so, we can respond to the rationality objection, of course, and we should also see how films resort to their specific cinematic nature in such a way that we can defend the bold thesis posed by Piso Livingston. When Thomas Wartenberg argues that the Matrix philosophizes through cinematic techniques, this is a way of saying that other artistic forms or other philosophies, traditional forms, could not have philosophized in the same way. The same happens when Sinnerbrink argues that Terrence Malick's The New World, and I quote, cannot be reduced to any specifically philosophical theme, idea, or perspective. End of quote. It is so new that it resists to any translation into non-philosophical thesis. For Sinnerbrink, in this case, philosophy only accompanies film. This is one of the reasons why he argues that there is a distinctively cinematography way of thinking. And I had a lot of text about thought experiments, but I don't think I have the time, so I'll just skip that. So if we stand by an inflationist naturalistic view of thought experiments, we can start to understand how there is a possibility that films can be philosophical thought experiments. Films can be detailed enough to avoid the type of objections made by, for example, Kathleen Wilkes, according to whom thought experiments lack detail, because films don't lack detail, or TV series, they are actually quite detailed, or at least, of course, not of the films. We are talking about generally, and we are also talking about mainstream Hollywood film, just to be clear. However, films are usually also open to more interpretation than traditional thought experiments, because philosophers, when they do thought experiments in text, they are already biased towards a conclusion. And this is an objection pointed by Daniel Dennett against thought experiments, that they are biased. So here in films, because they are not as biased, a lack of explicitness is actually advantageous. This, adding with the fact that films seem to be more in scope to our psychological proper domains, makes the possibility that defending a bold version of film as philosophy is actually more rational. I want to add some stuff because I skipped some important parts. So what's important to notice as well is that, for example, Tom McClelland analyzes some of the main objections made against thought experiments in philosophy. So philosophers like Kathleen Wilkes, Daniel Dennett, and Edward Machery, they are kind of skeptical against thought experiments. And of course, if thought experiments are not good philosophical tools, then defending film as philosophy through thought experimentation would not be very smart, right? But what McClelland makes is a very good strategy. He takes the objections made against thought experiments as opportunities to defend film as a better tool for thought experimentation. So, for example, when Kathleen Wilkes says that thought experiments are problematic because they lack detail, McClelland says films are more detailed, so films can be better thought experiments. Or, for example, as I already said, when Dennett says that films are biased, thought experiments are biased, films are not as biased, or at least the thought experiment presented in a film is not as biased, so it can be advantageous as well. And another important thing that I didn't say, so Edouard Machery, who is a defender of a new type of philosophy, which is called the experimental philosophy, is against the use of thought experiments because that's what he says, they are usually too fanciful. So they are too out of our proper capacities, our proper psychological capacities. We do not use that kind of thinking in our everyday lives, like Twin Earth or the P zombies. They are thought experiments that are so out of our everyday lives that they are not useful for Edouard Machery. But what Tom McClelland says is that in films, thought experiments are not as fanciful as the ones used in philosophy. They are more down to earth. They are more in our proper domains, so they can actually be better. Again, this to say that films can actually be better thought experiments. And just to finish, I want to say that this is not a defensive, I'm not saying that films can only philosophize through thought experimentation. This is just an hypothesis. Films can maybe do much more than this. And that's it. Thank you.
Diana, thank you very much for the great and inspiring lecture about thought experiments and film as philosophy. It was really nice to have you today in the first session. So now we have three presentation passed. It was Professor Turkovic, Professor Strein, and Professor Neva. I want to welcome our fourth presenter out of 5. And after the 5th presentation, we will have a 15 minutes discussion regarding all 5 presentations. So I want to welcome Professor Damir Smiljanic, from who is professor at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Novi Sad in Serbia. Hi, Damir, and thank you for being today with us at the International Film Festival Philosophy Conference. It's connected partly to what Diana was speaking about thought experiments, but your lecture is about dream sequences as philosophically relevant. So please take the floor. Thank you for joining us.
Okay. Thank you for your introduction. I hope that you can hear me. Okay.
Yes.
Then I will start. What makes a dream sequence philosophically relevant? Distinguishing reality from illusion is equally challenging for both philosophy and art. While philosophy is concerned with clearly drawing the line between being and non-being, art is rather playing with this line of demarcation. Certain forms motivate philosophers as well as artists to deal with these boundaries anew. Dream is one of these forms. Ever since Descartes' thought experiment about the genius malignus, philosophers have wondered how we can be sure that what is happening around us is not part of a dream, but an evident reality. Sorry, I had some problems with my... Okay. In contrast, art tends to create dreamlike realities in which the recipient can recover from stress of everyday life. Especially film art is characterized by the creation of such dream worlds. There is a special technique that can be used to bring the dream to light within a motion picture. It is called dream sequence. A dream sequence is a film scene that usually stands out from the rest of the story, and the content of which can vary from a more or less holiness to a series of unconnected events. Although it bears this name, a dream sequence does not necessarily have to reflect a specific dream content. Considering the fact that their structure resembles the process of dreaming, it makes sense to name these film sequences in that way. I will use 2 examples to show how a dream sequence can work well without referring to a special dream content, or how another can literally bring a dream to life using means of filmic expression. A whole film can look like a dream sequence, but just as a single dream sequence can represent a movie on a small scale, or even a film within a film. As already mentioned, a film sequence does not have to deal with dreams to be a dream sequence. As an example, we may refer to one of the most famous dream sequences in film history, the surrealistic masterpiece *And a Delusion Dog*, directed by Luis Buñuel and written by Buñuel and Salvador Dali. Although the film seems to depict scenes from real life, its plot follows the dream logic. Actually, there is no plot. The story does not have any sense. This is shown by the discontinuous chronology of the events in the film. 8 years have passed since the beginning scene, then one looks 16 years earlier, and finally, the film ends one spring without any other specification. In order to realize their main art intentions, that means to follow the surrealistic pattern of creation, the so-called automatic writing, Buñuel and Dali refused to tell the audience a conventionally structured story. They avoided a rational explanation of the presented scenes and hoped that the audience would perceive the stream of images without reading a fixed meaning from these images. Both drew the inspiration for the disturbing images from their dreams. Buñuel said that in one of his dreams, a cloud sliced the moon in half, like a razor blade slicing through an eye. Both was shown in the legendary opening scene of the film. Dali dreamed of a hand and of ants crawling out from a wound on its pole. These two bizarre dreams motivated the filmmakers to create some unforgettable sequences that can be taken as paradigmatic examples of what we call dream sequence. What does the example of this film show when it comes to the philosophical relevance of dream sequences? Obviously, these sequences do not necessarily have to be related to the filmic narrative. Moreover, they themselves do not have to be narrative at all. Dream sequences are autonomous. They follow a special logic, the dream logic. Within a cinematic work, they can mark a unique sphere of reality that has its own cognitive style, a typical form of spontaneity, a specific time structure, and social dimension. Although the scenes from An Illusion Dog do not represent a dream, there are structural similarities between them and dream fragments. Because of that, we can consider them dream sequences par excellence. The following example shows us how a single dream sequence can be the key to an adequate understanding of the plot of a film. It represents the missing link between events that have emerged in the past and events that are yet to come. It may not surprise us that Alfred Hitchcock, the famous master of suspense, used the dream motif in his films. This makes sense. It is well known that the British director was very interested in the methods and insights of psychoanalysis. His film, Spellbound, produced in 1945, is the very first film in which the great filmmaker has explicitly dealt with psychoanalytical topics. Literally, because one of the main protagonists of the film is the emotionless and distant psychoanalyst, Dr. Constance Peterson, played by Ingrid Bergman. She works at Green Manors, a mental hospital in Vermont. Things change when the surprisingly young Dr. Anthony Edwards, played by Gregory Peck, takes on the role of director of the hospital, replacing the much older Dr. Murchison. Constance falls in love with the new colleague, but also begins to doubt his identity when she realizes that the newcomer is suffering from a phobia. He always seems disturbed when he notices parallel lines on a white background. This is not the only disturbing discovery. Constance finds out that he also suffers from amnesia and believes that he has murdered the real Dr. Edwards, whose patient he actually was. His real name could be John Brown. After he fled, Constance tracks him down in a hotel. The two decide to get to the bottom of the matter and reveal Brown's true identity. Dr. Alexander Grulov, the former mentor of Constance, is providing shelter to the refugees. At his home, they are hiding from the police. During their stay, Dr. Grulov, things are slowly beginning to unfold. The false Dr. Edwards retells his host and Constance one of his dreams. That is the key scene in the film. Here's a short description of John Brown's dream. John is playing cards in a gambling house. The curtains in the house are covered with huge eyes. One person cuts up the curtains with giant scissors. All at once, an attractive young woman is getting closer to John and then suddenly starts kissing everyone in the room. Then an older card player is accused of cheating by the masked owner of the club. In the next dream scene, this old man falls from a roof of a house. The mysterious masked man is hiding behind the chimney with a distorted wheel in his left hand. In the last dream fragment, John is running down a hill, haunted by a gigantic shadow that looks like a pair of wings. What does this enigmatic dream sequence mean? Based on the interpretation of John's dream, Constance and Dr. Brulow presume that a skiing accident happened in Gabriel Valley, in which the real Dr. Edwards died. John and Constance travel to this place and try to reconstruct the circumstances of Edward's death. John recalls that his doctor fell off the cliff, but he also remembers that he unwillingly caused his brother's death as a child. The latter was the shocking experience that led to amnesia because he suppressed this experience. Finally, he remembers that his real name is John Ballantyne. After the police investigation shows that the real cause of Edward's death was a revolver shot to his back, John is arrested as a potential murderer. Fortunately, Constance manages to find the true killer as she returns to her hospital. Dr. Murchison turns out to be Edward's opponent, who wanted to get rid of him in order to regain his old head function as Green Manors. Murchison then threatens Constance with the same revolver he shot Dr. Edwards, but she is unfazed and decides to call the police, prompting Murchison to commit suicide. Finally, John and Constance find their happiness in marriage. This happy end shows that Hitchcock had to obey the unwritten rules of film industry in Hollywood. Regardless of this quite conventional ending of the story, Hitchcock's film Spellbound represents his introduction into filmic representation of psychoanalytical problems and situations, with its climax in such films like Vertigo or Psycho. Hence, it is not surprising that the famous director was interested in dreams, for two reasons: as a shortcut to the unconscious of his characters, and as a challenge to the use of filming techniques. The analysis of the aforementioned dreams sequence should take into account two aspects: its narrative relevance and the plausibility of its technical realization. From a narratological point of view, this sequence is of enormous importance for clarifying questions posed in the film. Who is Dr. Edwards' doppelganger? Did he kill Dr. Edwards? How did this happen? Without the dream sequence, and especially without its adequate interpretation, the plot would be meaningless and it would not be possible to find the right answers to those questions. The answers presented in a dream are given in a hidden form. The masked owner of the club who threatens the old card player is Dr. Murchison, despite the fact that John Ballantyne does not know the real identity of the threatening person. That explains why this man is wearing a mask. The crooked wheel held by the masked person is actually a revolver with which the crime will be committed. John's escape down the slope is an allusion to the skiing during which the accident happened. The latter escape is important to John for another reason. His return to Gabriel Valley gives him the opportunity to get rid of his guilt complex caused by the childhood trauma when he, due to unfortunate circumstances, knocked his brother onto a spiked fence. Remembering that shocking event leads in a psychoanalytical manner to a direct confrontation with the repressed past, releasing him from psychic pain. This makes it also clear why John gets panicky when he sees parallel lines on a white background. Like the traces in snow, these lines remind him every time of the accident when Dr. Edwards was killed. He incorrectly projects his guilt over his brother's death in the situation that happened in Gabriel Valley, convinced that he is responsible for Edward's death. When it comes to the technical aspect of the dream sequence, The fact that Hitchcock designed the sequence in collaboration with Dali gives it a special hallmark. Someone who was the co-author of a film in which the difference between real world and dream world began to disintegrate was ideal for conceiving such an important film scene. Surreal motives dominant in Dali's work prevail in that scene. Big eyes, giant scissors, unusual buildings, a distorted wheel, etc. In the dream sequence, there is no continuity. The scenes abruptly change. Unknown people are appearing even with a mask on the face. Indeed, these are typical attributes of dreams: fragmentation, distortion of form and size of objects, hidden symbolism, lack or concealment of personal identity, as indicated by the mask. The narrator's experience is purely visual, although we can hear Miklos Roja's Oscar-winning original score. But in the spectator's perspective, the fusion of sound and images intensifies the surreal effect of the sequence. Even though it does not last even 3 minutes, the dream sequence in Spellbound is crucial in order to understand the plot of the film. That means solving the murder of Dr. Edwards and revealing the true identity of the double John Valentine, including his release from the guilt complex. And now come to the end of my presentation. Instead of continuing to list other relevant examples, at the end of my presentation, I want to sketch an ambitious task for a philosophical analysis of dream sequences. According to the idea that there are different realities, including the world of dreams, we should examine that what happens to the viewer's consciousness during the reception of the film and how dream sequences affect their attention, at least to a certain extent. Phenomenology would be helpful here, especially one dealing with the epistemic status of multiple realities, for example, in Alfred Schütz, in his work, The Structures of a Life World. However, the most philosophically interesting cases of dream sequences could be those when the difference between dream and reality is no longer clear. In that case, our consciousness is involved in that game of perspectives, the consequence of which is a kind of mental state we might call harmless confusion. It is harmless because the viewers do not sleep and are able to become aware of the situation at any time, whenever they want, so that the nightmare shown in the sequence does not affect them directly. The game of perspectives can turn into playing with different levels of dream when the dreamer in the movie knows that he or she is dreaming. Such shifting from one level of dream to another you can find in Nolan's film Inception. Thus, what will be the further task of the analysis of dream sequences is to conceptualize a phenomenological theory of the attitude of the film viewer and explore the possibility of reaching different levels of dream experiencing, and maybe also the possibility of perceptual paradoxes that can completely confuse the audience. Finally, something needs to be said about the social dimension of dreams. Heraclitus once said that we all share the same world while we are awake, and that everyone lives in their own special while sleeping. Therefore, we could say that dream sequences in films reverse such a state of affairs. Just by watching such films, we come out of the solipsistic state, which is reached when an individual falls asleep. In other words, watching a movie is an unusual experience. While watching a movie in the cinema, we are dreaming together. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Smiljanic, thank you very much for the really interesting presentation and great examples from Hitchcock and connected with psychoanalysis as well. So it was really, really interesting. At the moment, we are waiting for Professor John or Melarka, who is having some problems from United Kingdom. He's a professor at the Department of Critical and Historical Studies, but he had some problem with the computer. So until he arrives, because what we have in the first session would be basically a lecture presentation by Professor Melarka, then the discussion, and then we have a coffee break of 15 minutes. So I propose that we switch his presentation for the possible discussion now, and then if Professor Melarka arrives, then we will hear his presentation. If not, we will have a coffee break. So I propose for the time being to maybe open the floor for a short discussion regarding the 4 great presentations which we had so far by Professor Turkovic, by Professor Strein, by Professor Niva, and by Professor Smiljanic regarding different aspects of film and philosophy. So if anybody, maybe Darko, do you want to?
You invite me to discuss anything.
If you wish, because I saw that you
yes, well, there's a lot to discuss, of course. But first of all, I would, concerning the question of cinema as art, I would remind us about Alain Badiou's definition, in which he says that film is not the 7th art, but one art more, signaling that the film is a sort of a synthetic art that takes over all other forms of art, which is obvious. You know, when you go to the cinema, you have pictures, you have music, you have singing, you have everything, you know, in architecture, whatever, you can, all other arts, in short. So, well, this is the first level of this. But I would say that this problem of cinema as art was first articulated by, in theory, by people like Arnhem and Epstein, who was also a filmmaker already in the 20s and so on. And it looked like that they were fighting for film to institutionalize somehow its position in the human universe as an artistic practice. But I think what proved with Walter Benjamin is that all this effort to establish film as an art was in vain, because if we read Benjamin in a very detailed way, then we suddenly understand that the right question is the other way around. Is the art still the art after the coming of cinema? And what the point which we can take from Benjamin is that the whole field of art is changed with the intrusion of cinema. So the film is subverting the very notion of art, and therefore also the traditional aesthetics. So we cannot think about art the same way we did before cinema appeared. So, well, this is of course put very, very crudely, but I would say this then opens also the field to this association between film and philosophy, because also I would maybe relate to what Diana Nieva was presenting, and that's this problem of thought. You know, it is. Can you still after the coming into the world of cinema, can you still think about a very notion of thought without being aware that any thought is already affected by being exposed to the moving images? That's one of the problems, but I shouldn't take too much time. And of course, I would also like to discuss, but the Buñuel and Hitchcock and the problem of dreams. And I would remind us of also, again, Gilles Deleuze and his discussion of the experimental cinema and of so-called gaseous image, so these gaseous images and so on. But of course, maybe through the day we will come back to it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strain. I just want just a technical remark. Professor John O'Melarka joined us. Welcome to our session. We have 20 minutes per talk, and we decided, John, to switch the discussion, and then it will be from until 1:15. So from 1 to 1:15, and at 1:15 it will be your lecture, if you're fine with that. And in the meantime, just to proceed with the discussions. Yes.
Sorry, so I'm not speaking now, no?
Yes, you are.
Oh, good, right, okay. I knew we were running 10 minutes late, and I've been running around having an adventure, so it's good to be here. So is there a share screen? Have I got the power to share screen?
John, just a second, because we've switched your place with the place for discussion. Just to finish what we've been discussing. So at 1:15 is, if it is okay with you, in 10 minutes from now.
Oh, 11:15. You're 1:15, maybe. I don't know where you are. 11:15, yes.
Oh, sorry, I'm wrong. It's 11:15.
11:15. I was wondering, yeah, 1:15.
In my dream sequence, I'm at 1. I'm sorry. So 11:15 in 10 minutes. So because Dr. Darko Strain posed a question which is important for all of us and our presenters today: is film still an art after? I mean, the art still has the same value after the cinema arrived, and was it film so subversive that it maybe changed the idea of art? And he also mentioned Diana Nieva's talk. Maybe somebody wants to catch up with his thoughts, or Diana maybe wants to add something to what Dr. Strain proposed, and maybe Professor Turkovic, maybe.
Just, you know, of course, when, say, new, how to say, new media or a new type of communication is introduced, and let us say film is a new type of communicative event, you know, it is supposed to change the map of other media or other arts, you know. So of course there is a change when something such as new media or digital media comes. There is a change, but I don't think it's a revolutionary change. It's just reshuffling our map and widening our also ontologies and our epistemologies. So I don't think that's so revolutionary that we have completely to change our attitudes and to dismiss, for example, the question of film art. Question of film art is still very well present, and nothing I don't think it could be just pushed away and replaced with something completely else. And for thought experiments, I have some, it was excellent exposition with all dilemmas and about whether thought experiments are how to say, can be taken as a real philosophy, film as philosophy. Namely, I have certain general skepticism. Now, first of all, most of what is discussed about philosophy, film as philosophy, is concerned with narrative film, with feature film. And it is quite embarrassing because it is quite difficult. A problem has have been shown to change something that is usually spontaneously experienced without any Gedanken, afterthoughts, to take as philosophical, so. And especially from my point of view, from point of view of my exposition, you have kinds of film which are argumentative, expository, which can develop thesis and philosophical thesis also with a lot of illustrations or case points and so on. And they're quite dismissed from the film as philosophy observation. For example, scientific films, educational films, you can develop with the help of a combination of like non-diegetic narrative with diegetic with diegetic illustrations or elaborations. You can have normal argumentative construction as we can find in philosophical text or any essay or any discourse, theoretical discourse. So it is something that is usually neglected, and this is the field for establishing philosophical films, with real argumentation, with explicitness, or with associatively rich example film samples and samples from film and so on. So this is one of my points. The second point is that usually approach to the problem why, for example, such expository discourses are not taken as philosophically relevant is the basically purist approach to film. Mostly those who are defending the possibility of film as philosophy are taking that film is essentially visual media, and so verbal part of film is discounted, only as a dialogue, perhaps philosophical dialogues among characters, and this supposition is quite old-fashioned. Verbal part of a film is a legitimate part of film world, of film creativity, and why not, for example, with atheistic or expository films, do philosophy, in the same way as. So that's. I will stop.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Turkovic. I think that Professor Jono Melarka wants to add to the discussion. John, do you want to?
Well, yeah, just a couple of points quickly, like going back to the problem of film philosophy and what is a philosophical film. I always think it's notable that when I'm teaching film and philosophy to students, we kind of go through a number of different, in a sense, paradigms or ways in which film and philosophy can be related. Can film be philosophical in its own right as a film art, rather than by being reduced to some textual elements like the plot or dialogue that can then be used in comparison with traditional textual philosophy of Plato or Descartes. And we look at philosophers who are striving to give us the essence. Here is what is cinema, and Deleuze says this, and Badiou says this, and Rancière says that, and so on. But we always begin with a kind of analytically inclined way of using film to teach philosophy. Texts by Mark Rowlands and Mary Litch and Christopher Falzon. And they usually, they'll use the classics, they'll use Bergman, they'll use science fiction, high concept cinema, The Matrix, etc. And they'll go through the classic areas of philosophy, starting with meta-philosophy, what is philosophy, and then going into metaphysics, epistemology. But in every case, they ignore aesthetics, which is always interesting. There's hardly anything to be said, a little bit in Falzon, less so in Litch and Rowlands, less about aesthetics and art. And I think part of the problem is that if they did talk about that traditional area of teaching philosophy, then they would have to raise the question of, well, what is film as art? And why are we ignoring the cinematic, or let's say less textual elements? I grant you, of course, that text, dialogue, and so on, story, narrative is part of a film as well. It's not as though it's all about, movement and choreography and light and sound. It's also, textual meaning. But nonetheless, in that analytic pedagogical use of film, the question of film art or aesthetics is often set aside, partly, I think, because then they would have to question their own use or instrumentalization of film as text in order to teach philosophy, but also because they raise a rather old-fashioned question of what is art anyway, and maybe they just don't want to go down that big old question of what is art anyway. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you so much. Yeah, by the way, we will continue at 5 p.m. with the general discussion about all presentations. Just before Professor Melarca gives his final presentation in the first session, I want to give a floor to Professor Dominique Chateau. He raised his hand. Please, the comments for this part.
Thank you. Just a remark about the problem of transcendentalism and Ozu, because I think that this problem shows what's the most general and sensitive problem of the philosophy of film philosophy. The choice of the philosophical references that we associate to the films. In this case, Ozu, one very important point of view should be added in, I think, to the discussion, the Japanese philosophy, which is at such a big problem. To be rough, its philosophy is linked to religion in a very particular sense, possibly 2 religions, Buddhism and Shintoism. But this point of view is very important to understand Ozu's films. Ozu is buried at Engakuji in Kamakura, and Engakuji is one of the most important Zen Buddhist temples in Japan. And there are nothing written on the grave. It's something very, very interesting. No names. He's buried with his mother in the grave. But there is just the character mu, nothingness. And it's a Zen character. So I think that if you take into account this reference, the discussion would be very, very different from the Deleuze and Schrader discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Chateau. And then we are welcoming your presentation as a keynote speaker in the second session. In the later session. Thank you so much to everybody for the great discussion, and we will continue at 5 p.m. With the general discussion. Now I want to give the floor to the last participant in the first session, that is Joe Melarca. He is a professor at the Department of Critical and Historical Studies in London, and he's also part of the editorial board of the very famous journal Film Philosophy, also in United Kingdom. So Professor Melarka, the floor is yours. We have 20 minutes, so great. I will give a verbal sign of 5 minutes when that.
Okay, right here. Do I have the, shall I share, can I share the?
Yes, please, you can.
Now
it's open.
Share that. It's just a few slides to kind of, instead of just looking at me.
Thank you. We can see.
So, thank you very much. Sorry for the rush around. I've had mechanical material interventions, basically a car that broke down, children that needed to get to school, and then on top of that, a computer that decided not to boot up. So I've got my backup computer here. So anyway, I'll crack on. So continuity errors, and oops, no, that's got the wrong slide on it anyway, but let's go here. Yeah, we'll start here. Continuity errors and the indivisibility of change. Introduction. There's 3 parts to it. Time travel, film philosophy, something on the philosophy of time, and then something on the way in which cinema itself, and I think I am talking about the visual components of cinema itself, operating or interrogating something about how time, how we travel in time, and whether we need a machine or not for time travel. So, can we will ourselves to go back in time? In one sense, this is just the abstract, really. Only Bergson thought that we could do so. He was an advocate of attention training, educating our senses to the specificities of every image in order to expand our experience of time, duration, or what he called also an attention to life. This image perception was not simply about noticing spatial differences alone, however, for in expanding one's attention, one also expands one's temporal horizon, at least according to Bergson. One travels into the so-called past, if only for a few moments, by expanding or defragmenting one's present. This is not a supersensuous escape from perceiving the present, but rather an expansion of the present through a deepening of the senses, an excess of materiality rather than a disembodying spirit. Now, this talk is going to cross-examine Bergson's notion of attention to life by intersecting it with Jenno Swark's cult film of 1980, Somewhere in Time, not from any, other than the fact that it's a basic schmaltzy romance film that deals with time travel, not for many a very philosophical film, but I think it's got some interesting ideas going on inside it. And I'm doing this in order to unearth a strange conception of time travel underlying the story, one different to Bergson's in part, but still kindred. From Richard Matheson, also famous for a whole bunch of other films, Shrinking Man and I Am Legend, from Richard Matheson's film script, which was adapted from his 1975 novel, Bid Time Return, through to the ideas of time, attention, and memory that it relays via the metaphysical theories of J.W. Dunn and J.B. Priestley, we will see that, as with Bergson, it is not through any disembodied supernatural will alone that the hero of the story, played by Christopher Reeve, operates his so-called time machine. Rather, it is also through his use of ordinary objects and performative acts, self-hypnosis being one, and an attention to reversing certain discontinuities within his surrounding imagery that a kind of Proustian space-time travel is activated. Not by escaping the present, but by expanding and multiplying it in a manner compatible, I think, with Bergson's attention to life. Okay, that's probably familiar if you had a read of the abstract. Opening in 1980, Somewhere in Time, the film, relates the tale of Richard Collier, played by Reeve, a man who travels back to 1912 through the agency of sheer willpower and mind manipulation. He has no time machine, no time tunnel, TARDIS, DeLorean car, or any other mechanical device. He only has his will, plus a set of props, costumes, and performative acts used to train his belief or alter his consciousness, if you prefer, to propel him through time. Nor is sleep used, or dream even, as a mode of time travel, as in the story of Rip Van Winkle, who sleeps through 20 years, or more spectacularly, Woody Allen's Sleeper, 1973, whose protagonist wakes up 200 years later. Nor is there a time slip in space, as in Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court from 1989. Instead, Richard journeys by, firstly, dressing and grooming himself in such a manner as to offer the appearance typical of a man of this period, June 27, 1912, to be precise. He also immerses himself as best he can in an atmosphere of the past and a location, namely the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island, Michigan, which is almost left unaltered, but still operating from 1912. A kind of Proustian space that will help him recreate and inhabit the past. He further adds to the period authenticity of the space by removing, again as best he can, all the contemporary objects from his hotel room. He will have to, as he puts it, dissociate himself entirely from his present. Once this preparation is complete, he then attempts to hypnotize himself into thinking he is in 1912 through a form of autosuggestion. As Matheson's source text, his own book, Bid Time Return, puts it, using the earlier date of 1896 in that text as the target for the time travel, quote, using the principles of psycho-cybernetics, I can reprogram myself to believe that I exist, not in 1971, the book's setting, but in 1896. The hotel will help because so much of 1896 still exists within its walls. The location is perfect. The method's sound. It will work. I know it will, unquote. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. It doesn't work initially anyway, but it does after a number of a few false starts. Okay, next section. The ABC of time. Now, what Somewhere in Time, alongside its original source, Bid Time Return, offers us, therefore, is nothing less, one might say, than Matheson's own take on the metaphysics of time and time travel. A helpful way to explore Matheson's metaphysics of time is through the framework, well known these days, of J.M.E. McTaggart's A theory and B theory, first expounded in his 1908 essay, The Unreality of Time. In this schema, McTaggart offers a useful categorization of the two primary ways in which we think about time. A and B are two quite different theories of time, according to McTaggart, each with their own vocabulary of A series determinations and B series relations. Change, says McTaggart, belongs to the A series. It pertains to what we call dynamic time or temporal becoming, with its three determinations of past, present, and future. Yet time can also be seen as a set of relations between events that are earlier, simultaneous with, or later than one another. This is the B series. Who are the A theorists? Well, Bergson's identification of passage or becoming with time certainly makes him, like most process philosophers, an A theorist on this score. And all language of past, present, and future is A theory language too, given its built-in dynamism. That which was future becomes present, then becomes the past. Whereas that which was earlier than, simultaneous with, or before, those are more eternal, well, they are eternal relations. This would make Matheson an A theorist as well. Collier travels to the past, not to the before. But what about traveling per se within this type of time? One might ask that this is simply what Bergson would call spatialization. The error of treating time as a dimension of space, a line that can be traveled over. Matheson's film is called, after all, Somewhere in Time, not Some When in Space. And yet there are complications, for here is the rub. For McTaggart, the A theory is paradoxical in as much as any event having three incompatible determinations, an event is past, then present, or sorry, future, then present, then past, is contradictory. Hence, the title of McTaggart's essay is The Unreality of Time, because, as a good British Hegelian, he believes that time is unreal, or rather, that absolute reality is atemporal, something he describes in terms of his concept of a C series of timeless relations. This third series is not unlike Gilles Deleuze, who we heard mentioned earlier, third synthesis of eternal return, ion or the virtual, when he's speaking with the Bergsonian hat on, introduced in his 1968 thesis, Difference and Repetition. It is also similar to what J.B. Priestley called time 3. As Matheson, and this is a citation from the book Bid Time Return, as Matheson, speaking through the character of Collier, puts it, quote, and this is from the book, J.B. Priestley speaks of 3 times. He calls time 1, He calls them time 1, time 2, and time 3. Time 1 is the time into which we are born, grow old and die, the practical and economic time, the brain and body time. Time 2 leaves this simple track. Its scope includes coexistent past, present, and future. No clocks and calendars determine its existence. Entering it, we stand apart from chronological time and observe it as a fixed oneness rather than as a moving array of moments. Time 3 is that zone where the power to connect or disconnect potential and actual exists. Time 2 might be the afterlife, claims Priestley. Time 3 might be eternity. So time 2, alternatively, is Proustian. There's an extreme depth of field shot, in fact, worth having a look at in Somewhere in Time. That's famous amongst the film's devotees when Richard and Elise, the character, I haven't got time to go into the plot, I'm not going to, but the reason why he's going back to 1912 is to fall in love with somebody he previously fell in love with when he existed, having already previously passed into the past. It's one of those circular time travel stories. Elise is this character played by Jane Seymour. And we have this shot, an extreme depth of field shot, with both of them in focus. This is a scene when he's gone back in 2012, but each is thinking that the other has left the Grand Hotel forever. But they unexpectedly discover each other on its grounds. In the foreground, no pun intended, Richard, and in the background, Elise, are kept in perfect equal focus through the use of a split diopter and good old-fashioned analog filmmaking. This special optical effect, effectively, arguably, demonstrates the fixed oneness of time too, where past, distal, and present, proximal, are equally real. Yet, for Bergson, at least, such a realism towards the past does not necessitate a lack of movement or vitality, that is, an afterlife. Even less does it require any concomitant spatialization when traveling in this time. So let's have a little bit more from Bergson. In his 1911 lecture, The Perception of Change, Bergson says that, quote, the preservation of the past in the present is nothing else than the indivisibility of change, unquote. The past is preserved in the present, but not by existing alongside as a ghostly double haunting it, so much as being a new, broader present that incorporates that narrow present and its so-called past. As such, what we call the present is relative. And here's a fairly well-known quote from Bergsonians in the audience. So let us reflect for a moment on this present, which alone is considered to have existence. What precisely is the present? My present at this moment is the sentence I'm pronouncing, but it is so because I want to limit the field of my attention to life, to my sentence. This attention is something that can be made longer or shorter, like the interval between 2 points of a compass. Let us go further. An attention that could be extended indefinitely would embrace, along with the preceding sentence, all the anterior phases of the lecture and the events which preceded the lecture, and as large a portion of what we call our past as desired. The distinction we make between our present and past is therefore, if not arbitrary, at least relative to the extent of the field which our attention to life can embrace. So Bergson's philosophy of past and present actually then concerns an attention training that reveals an indivisibility amongst different kinds of presence, multiple presents, each a different durée subtending the next. Consequently, his picture of time perception should not be seen in terms of one present haunted by the past in general, an eternal ion or virtual, but in terms of multiple presents that constantly vie for our attention. Bergsonian time travel, therefore, does not concern a past that is being preserved, but rather which present is being attended. And there is a real effort in undoing the cut or fragmentation between past and present, an effort of will. And obviously in that story, although Bergson isn't one of the theoretical references for Richard Matheson, nonetheless, the idea of extending one's attention in order to travel into the past, that is the time machine. And it seems to be, along with the performative acts and props and costume and setting, seems to be how Matheson believes we can move in time, such that mental, so-called mental time travel is not only mental, it is as good a time travel as you're ever going to get. Okay, third section, final section. Continuity errors and the invisibility of change. When bit time return describes Collier's passage between time zones, it is first described as a flicker and later as like slipping through film. Quote, a physical sensation akin to sliding backward through a film, the zone of conjunction, whatever it may be, an entryway, an opening, a film is something very close and very thin, unquote. How this idea is visually represented in the 1980 film adaptation is significant here because for any moment, such as this, in a time travel film, there is the optical problem of connecting two times in transition, short of simply using a dissolve, a fade out or fade in, which would only be to connect them ad hoc, as it were. Computer-generated morphing technology, unavailable to Swark in 1980 anyway, would be literally superficial. What would the interim shapes be? Surreal objects from no time, whatever. So if you're not going to have a machine, a time tunnel or DeLorean, how then to show this becoming, this transition? Still in 1980, Collier places his head on a patterned blanket and falls asleep while performing his auto-hypnosis. There are then a number of cutaways, one of them an unfocused point of view shot as Collier begins to regain consciousness. Then we cut back to this close-up, still with the leaf trellis pattern in view. I'll give you a little, see what it looks like. Here we go. So the shot above is from where he is still in the present, and the shot below is when he awakes in the surroundings. We have this tight close-up of his face that we transition between from a point of view shot. We cut back to this close-up, still with the leaf trellis pattern in view, only he's changed in color and texture. If you look at it above, it's actually a pillow, and below it's a cushion. Indeed, as the camera pulls back, we see that the fabric has changed as that of a period sofa cushion, and that Collier is rising up to the vertical, not from a bed, but a period couch from 1912. There are other changes during the transition, namely to the lighting and background sounds, horses' hooves on cobbled stones being prevalent. But why this odd continuity in the one element of our field of vision other than Collier or his face in particular? That the trellis pattern exists on a blanket and a pillow in 1980 and a cushion in 1912 in exactly the same point in space within the hotel and indeed the whole world does seem highly improbable. Even were the pattern to prove to be an emblem of the Grand Hotel, rendered in the exact same style and scale for at least 68 years, it is not according to the plot, by the way, that Collier should choose to rest his head on it in one zone and for it to appear still in the next zone, in the past, under his head as he awakes, seems again unlikely, to say the least. Now, of course, on one level, we know why this was done and do not need to speculate any further. The trellis, the pattern, creates a material continuity that allows a metonymic Collier, namely his face, a smooth transition, a visual bridge, so to speak. An extreme close-up of his face alone filling our visual field would be too subjective, leaving the journey a product of his imagination from the very start. How long do I have left? I see a sort of... Give me a figure. 2, 1,
yes,
0?
5 more.
Okay, I'll be done. Okay.
4 more. Thanks.
So an extreme close-up of his face alone filling our visual field would be too subjective, leaving the journey a product of his imagination from the very start. Maybe only it was all in his head as a dream. He must carry another image with him to make the transition real for us, but still not as a diegetic object that is visible to him, for that would thereby ruin his transport, at least according to Matheson's logic of the need for complete dissociation from the present. Hence his roughly correct period clothing is allowed. He must have no props, nothing from the present. All the material surroundings must be period correct to get him back there, so to speak. Hence no modern technology, DeLoreans or what have you. There is literally a continuity error in what is retained or made continuous. So it's not the error of a discontinuity, but a strange kind of thinking that we need a continuity in order to create this transition. A continuity error that is retained rather than what is left out. For irrespective of what Collier notices or not, it is he alone who is traveling in time. Nothing should make the journey to the past other than Collier, given his means of sheer volition. He had nothing else but Collier, whatever that might mean. Last paragraph. However, had the filmmakers more faith perhaps in the inherent discontinuity of cinema, its fragmentation, then they might have achieved a normal transition, only one based on heterogeneity. What would that look like? Quite ordinary, in fact, I would argue. But the truth is that no film has ever represented a supposedly real continuous time when it has involved more than one continuous shot, and even then, not, I would say. This is not the case that because film lacks the ability to capture real time, but because there is no pure single continuous time to capture, this being Bergson's process view, of course. Or rather, real time just is the host of different kinds of time being made continuously, a continuity of the heterogeneous and, in cinematic terms, images in the process of fragmenting and defragmenting themselves perpetually. Continuity versus discontinuity, therefore, is a false opposition when time actually comes in different varieties, with no one time transcending all others. Newton's absolute time that, quote, flows equably without regard to anything external, unquote, being a putative one-dimensional clock time of the universe that is disavowed in this way of looking at time. The error is in a certain continuity of the same, namely homogeneity. And what we've just said about set decor could equally be said about cinematography, dialogue, or even character psychology. Discontinuities, inconsistencies, or unevenness may actually be precisely the right formula for traveling in time. Okay, that's it, finished.
It was really on time. I mean,
Well,
11:40.
how non-Bergsonian of me to be sticking to the clocks, really, I suppose.
Yes, we had to, but you are really, thank you, Professor Malarkey, for coming, despite the problems with the car, I know, and then with the computer. And I think that the first session could be concluded with 5 extraordinary presentations by Professor Turkovic, by Professor Strain, by Professor Neiva, Professor Smiljanic, and Professor Malarkey. Even we had the discussion of 15 minutes. We can do one of the 2 things. We can go for a coffee break because we really finished our part. It will be 15 minutes coffee break. Or we can have a short question to Professor John now, or we can leave it for 5 p.m. So I am having a problem with time, John, as you can see. I'm mixing times. But maybe if you want, we can go for a 15 minutes coffee break, and then Darko, you prefer to go, and then John, maybe
everybody would prefer that.
Okay, because it was a it was.
You have to decide. You are the master.
Okay, then I'm masterfully deciding that we've been working for 2 hours, and then in the next session, which will be moderated by Professor Vangel Nonevsky, then John, questions to your great presentation will be directed in the second part, and then in the general discussion at 5 p.m. now. I will try to be Bergsonian. So have a great coffee, everybody. 15 minutes on the same Zoom link which you've received. Now it's 11:40. So we are meeting at 11:55. I know we are stupid with this timing, but that means that we will really be on time with the, so just 15 minutes, okay? It's not 12, but 11:55 on the same Zoom link.
Okay.
For the second part. Thank you so much to everybody at the first session. Have a great coffee and see you in 15 minutes. See you.